Haftarah. I felt so honored to be invited to give an intro to this, and now here we are, looking at the sixth of seven of these Haftarot of consolation. And I know that in prior sessions, there's been some review of Isaiah and a little bit about what these are doing liturgically, but I just want to go through that again in case anyone missed that or could use a little bit of a refresher. So we talked a little bit about in our intro about what a haftarah is, why we say them, what the practice is. Um, and this particular time of year is the time of year where we have these seven haftarot of consolation because we're moving from the sorrow of Tisha B'Av and we are moving towards Rosh Hashanah. So of course now this is being recorded in the halfway part of Elul. It's the 16th of Elul today, and so Rosh Hashanah is literally 2 weeks out, and we are nearing the end of this series of haftarot of consolation. The interesting thing here is that with regards to our Parsha, I know we'll be doing that tomorrow, but with regards to our Parsha, I think this Haftarah is really a bit of a spiritual antidote because Kitavo, which is the Parsha we're reading this week, contains one of the two lengthy tochachas, one of the two lengthy rebukes. Rebuke doesn't even feel like a strong enough term. Tochacha is like really, really strong. It's a very lengthy series of curses that will happen if we don't follow the mitzvot. So we've just read that, and even though customarily it's read very quietly, it's still there in the parsha. And then we move to the haftarah. And thinking about how this happens ritually on a Shabbat morning, I know that everyone's coming from different backgrounds and has different particular customs on Shabbat morning, but from where I am situated in the synagogues that I usually frequent, you have the Torah reading, and then there's basically a little bit of a little bit of a break for a Kaddish, and then you move right into the Haftarah. So it can be a little bit of a major transition to move from a parsha that is, replete with this very lengthy series of curses. It also does include a lengthy series of blessings as well. That's important to name. And then we move into this exquisite poem in Isaiah. And ultimately, this particular week's Haftarah is about restoration and what things will be like when we've been restored to the land of Israel. And I want to name, to begin with, a few things about where we are in the book of Isaiah, and particularly where we are just thinking about the calendar and liturgically. So, and also when this was likely written, and then we'll dive into the actual text. So I want to name that there were some technical difficulties on my end, and the commentary that I wanted to bring to you today was not cooperating with me technically. So I'm going to do the best I can to just kind of to name and to summarize a little bit of Robert Alter's commentary on this Haftarah. If you happen to have a physical copy of the Hebrew Bible translation done by Robert Alter, you might find it useful to have it. But if you don't have it, great, it's totally fine. One of the things that Robert Alter talks about is that in the Haftarah that we're looking at this week, which is all of chapter 60 of Isaiah, it was likely written in the 5th century of the Common Era, before the Common Era, when basically the Jewish people were in a place of incredible dispossession and ruin because we had just been through the destruction of the first temple in 586 before the Common Era. And we had not yet returned back. There was a 70-year exile after that destruction. So the nation that Isaiah is speaking to here is a nation that is very, very diminished. And so the notion of this period of constriction is going to come to an end, and you will, in fact, experience this period of joy is something that the prophet is really trying to invite people towards. but the people are probably not, it's hard to know in terms of imagination if the people in fact are experiencing that is anything other than fanciful, right? But it's something that I think instills a lot of hope into people as well. And for our purposes, in terms of how our calendrical cycle works, we are at this point where we've been journeying from Tisha B'Av and we're almost at Rosh Hashanah, and we're about to enter a new year. And, the truth is, as we know every year, but I think especially as we know from this year, and, even for years prior to that, with all of the chaos in our world right now, that we don't actually know what's going to happen in the year to come. So trying to give people an idea of hope, a way of kind of thinking forward and really imagining a better tomorrow, a tomorrow in which fortunes are completely reversed. We're going to actually go through, and I want to invite a communal reading of this Haftarah. But I want to do that by inviting, if anyone wants to read, please indicate that. Um, Please go ahead and indicate that to Tamara, and we will make sure that you are called on. So if you want to read, feel free to put that in the chat. But please, if you do want to read, make sure that you have the text queued up. We are going to just look at this text together. It's a bit of a long text. It's 22 verses, so maybe we'll have a couple of people read a couple of verses at a time. And this way, we all kind of get familiar with this actual text. And the first thing to say before we dive right in is that we are again in the latter half of Isaiah, which is filled with prophecies that are hopeful. So yeah, with that, if you would like to start with Isaiah 60, verse 1, maybe we'll have different readers. Maybe we'll have like one person go from 1 to 10 or 1 to 11, and then another reader go from 12 to 22. So if you would like to read for us in the English, that would be great.
Thank you. In just a second, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah, so I'll ask you to unmute. And before I do that, I'm going to change the layout of our text so we have the Hebrew next to the English. Deborah, you should be able to unmute now. Thank you for volunteering, and whenever you're ready.
I can. Arise, shine, for your light has dawned. The presence of God has shone upon you. Behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick clouds the peoples. But upon you God will shine, and God's presence be seen over you. And nations shall walk by your light, kings by your shining radiance. Raise your eyes and look about. They have all gathered and come to you. Your sons shall be brought from afar, your daughters like babes on shoulders. As you behold, you will glow, your heart will throb and thrill, for the worth of the sea shall pass on to you. The riches of nations shall flow to you. Dust clouds of camels shall cover you. Dromedaries of Midian and Ephah, they all shall come from Sheba. They shall bear gold and frankincense and shall herald God's glories. All the flocks of Kedar shall be assembled for you. The rams of Nebaioth shall serve your needs. They shall be welcoming offerings on my altar, and I will add glory to my glorious house. Who are these that float like a cloud, like doves to their coats? Behold, the coastlands await me, with ships of Tarshish in the lead, to bring your children from afar, and their silver and gold as well. For the name of the eternal your God, for the Holy One of Israel, who has glorified you. Aliens shall rebuild your walls, their kings shall wait upon you, for in anger I struck you down, but in favor I take you back. Your gates shall always stay open. Day and night they shall never be shut, to let in the wealth of the nations with their kings in procession. For the nation or the kingdom that does not serve you shall perish. Such nations shall be destroyed. The majesty of Lebanon shall come to you, cypress and pine and box, to adorn the site of my sanctuary, to glorify the place where my feet rest. Bowing before you shall come the children of those who tormented you. Prostrate at the soles of your feet shall be all those who reviled you, and you shall be called City of God, Zion of the Holy One of Israel.
I stopped scrolling, Rabbi Lauren, just because we are past our 10 verses, but if you'd like to keep going, we can certainly keep.
Oops, sorry, I didn't know I was supposed to stop.
No,
Deborah,
no.
you're doing great. I mean, if you don't mind keeping going that to the end, that would be fantastic.
Great, okay.
I don't mind, but also don't want to take up too much space if someone else would like to read.
Would
Thank you.
anyone else like to read?
Deborah, you have a very powerful voice for this Haftorah. No one wants to follow you. So if you're comfortable.
Okay.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This is amazing.
Okay. Whereas you have been forsaken, rejected, with none passing through, I will make you a pride everlasting, a joy for age after age. You shall suck the milk of the nations, suckle at royal breasts, and you shall know that I, God, am your Savior. I, the mighty one of Jacob, am your Redeemer. Instead of copper, I will bring gold. Instead of iron, I will bring silver. Instead of wood, copper. And instead of stone, iron. And I will appoint well-being as your government, prosperity as your officials. The cry, violence, shall no more be heard in your land, nor rack and ruin within your borders. And you shall name your walls victory and your gates renown. No longer shall you need the sun for light by day, nor the shining of the moon for radiance by night. For God shall be your light everlasting. Your God shall be your glory. Your sun shall set no more, your moon no more withdraw, for God shall be a light to you forever. And your days of mourning shall be ended. And your people, all of them righteous, shall possess the land for all time. They are the shoot that I planted, my handiwork in which I glory. The smallest shall become a clan, the least a mighty nation. I, God, will speed it in due time.
That was such a wonderful reading. Thank you, Deborah, so much. That's extraordinarily powerful. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so this Haftarah has a lot in it, right? And usually, like when I teach the Torah studies, I often will have a verse or two or three in mind from the Parsha because it's not practical to go through the entire Parsha in the period of time we have allotted. But because this Haftarah, even though it is 22 verses, but I think it's really important for us to get the whole scope of what's happening here and for us to really be able to be with what this poet really it's in so many ways it's a poet, it's a prophecy, is really conveying, and to name that it's complex and that we might be coming with a lot of different reactions. We might find this really comforting, we might find this challenging, we might not have a reaction at all, we might have a lot of questions arising, and all of that is welcome and more. And so I want to just point out a couple of things that I think are really important to note about this chapter. The first is that if we're thinking about this liturgically again, we have the Parsha of Kitavo. And yes, it is true, as I said in the introduction to the Haftarah series a few weeks ago, that these Haftarot are not actually directly correlated with their Parshiot because they are playing a different role. These Haftarot are comforting us as we are in this in-between place between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. At the same time, I think this Haftarah is comforting, or could be comforting, juxtaposed to the Parsha of Ki Tavo, in which we, as I said before, have these very significant curses if we don't follow the mitzvot, and a sense of lacking in righteousness if we don't follow the mitzvot. And here in this Haftarah, we are reminded that all of us are righteous. We're going to spend a little bit of time on that verse, especially because it's Elul. I think that also is a significant verse. We also, I think it's just fun to point out, if we look at the first verse of chapter 60, Humi ori kiva or orech ukavod Hashem alaych zarach, excuse me. This notion of kumi uri might ring a bell. In the latter half of Isaiah, there are multiple chapters that have their beginning as a verse that was adapted for the Chadodi. A lot of Shlomo Alkabetz, who composed the Chadodi and Sfat in the 17th century, I believe, of the Common Era. He was one of the major Kabbalists in Sfat. I'm very influenced by Louisiana Kabbalah. And Shlomo Alkabetz composed La Chadodi as a piyut, as a liturgical poem for welcoming Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat in and of itself is a Kabbalistic ritual, which has now become very normalized, although it did not exist even a few hundred years ago. But this beautiful piyut of L'Chadodi, which we're not going to look at today, has as one of its stanzas an adaptation from this opening verse. This notion of this light will shine after this period of darkness and constriction. And I think that's a really interesting thing to note, that became part of liturgy. And we often don't connect it back to Isaiah because we're so often the piyut is so familiar that a lot of the biblical references are not so known to those who sing it on Friday nights, as many of us will in just over 24 hours from now, depending on where you are in the world. So that's something interesting to note. I think also there's something really interesting to note about the reminder or refrain, perhaps we could call it, in this Haftarah, that the Jewish nation, the Judahites, we might call them, will in fact be, they will become more powerful. Like right now, they're in this very diminished state, and they will become more powerful, and other nations will come to them. And there's a lot of that here. And I want to just say we are sticking to this text. So you might have reactions arising for you about the world we're in now. That is very welcome. But in terms of our interactions today around this text and in terms of our learning, we are going to stick to the actual text itself and what's arising out of the text. We're not going to go into other things that are arising. I know that are arising certainly for me, and I imagine are arising for others as well. But we're going to really stick to the actual text of the Haftarah and name that here the author, Isaiah, presumably, although scholars have different ideas about who that author could be. Was it one Isaiah, two Isaiah, three Isaiah? There are a lot of different questions around that. For our purposes, we're just going to call the author Isaiah. And that this author is really thinking about what this change, what this restoration or transition is going to mean after a period of subjugation, a period of incredible challenge. And remember that less than a century before this was composed, the Jewish people were uprooted violently from the land. So if we think about the historical context in which this is arising, that's an important piece of the backdrop. I think that it's important to know that because a lot of times with Tanakh, as we see with L'Chadodi and other things, we can take psukim, we can take verses, and we can put them in other places, and they bring on more liturgical significance. But as we do that, sometimes we forget the larger context in which this actually occurs. I want to also just highlight a verse in our Haftarah, and if we can maybe screen share again, I'd like to highlight a verse in our Haftarah, which I have a Hebrew text in front of me right now, and wonderful, thank you. Let's scroll down to 21, to verse 21. And there's this interesting notion in the beginning of verse 21 that says that all of the people are righteous. And one way to translate that, one way that I would translate that is forever, or that there's a way in which we can return to that place of righteousness. Which, if we think about the the time of year which we're reading this, it's almost Rosh Hashanah. And because it's almost Rosh Hashanah, many of us have been doing a spiritual inventory of sorts, thinking about our actions, where we've been in the last year, what kind of tshuva we need to do. And there's this idea that the Haftarah gives us that we can return, that ultimately, even with all of this physical restoration that will arise, according to Isaiah, we also have this notion of total cosmological shift. We won't even need the sun and the moon, because ultimately, at the end of the day, like, we are so connected to the divine. We are so righteous. We are able to return to that. And I think that there is a lot of power, and I think that there can also be a little bit of danger. And that's why I think the historical context of knowing that this was written less than a century after the destruction of the first temple, when people were starting to return, I think is really important, because context really matters for how words are understood, and context really matters for how we bring them into our own path. So I think for us, perhaps we can think about a verse like verse 21 in chapter 60 of Isaiah, and think about how that might be a comfort to us spiritually, and it might be a charge to us, right? Because Elul is all about responsibility. It's about return, but it's also about responsibility, and saying we are going to try to be better people in the new year. And if we believe that there is possibility that we can be better in the new year, we can bring ourselves to a verse like this and say, oh, we do have that capacity for righteousness. We do have that capacity for doing goodness in the world and doing acts of care and love and kindness in the world. And even though the context, again, of this chapter is this prophecy, this imagining of what it will be like when the Jewish people have returned to the land after the destruction of the first temple, there is a lot, though, that we can take and apply in our own lives without forgetting that original context. So what I'm inviting us to do with this Haftarah is to hold multiple things at once. We can hold that for many, many thousands of years of exile, that I could imagine that people would be sitting in synagogues this time of year reading this Haftarah, and I could bring a lot of comfort. We can read it on a level of spiritual comfort, that we are in fact all righteous, that there is this way that we can return, that's available to us in this time of Elul. We can hold that this particular Haftarah was written in a context where the people that Isaiah is speaking about are returning to the land, and Isaiah is imagining what it will be like when the masses return. Because again, the exile had happened less than a century prior, and there was a thriving diaspora community, and people were coming back. But my understanding is that it wasn't actually a very significant return at first. So thinking about what that could be like as it was continuing to happen, and what that would mean, and what that would feel like and be experientially. So I want to open it up and again, I want to ask people to be concise, please, so we hear from as many people as we can. I want to invite questions about the text or about any of the points that I've raised about the text, liturgically and otherwise. I want us to really remain in this text. And if there's anything that you have in the chat, also I will invite questions in the chat. But I would like to hear from as many of you as possible. So we'll take questions in groups and then I'll respond in one round to multiple questions.
Amazing, thank you. And I did put the link in the chat, and I'll do that once again, just in case you'd like to look at the text again before you ask a question. And I know this is actually my bat mitzvah parsha, and I read the Haftorah, and so it's bringing a lot back. So this is nice to look at it more than 13 years later. So thank you, Rabbi. I have many questions, but again, I'd love to hear from you all. Please raise your Zoom hand or write your question in the chat.
I'd love to hear from you too. So, feel free to ask any of your questions as well. It's always kind of fun to reminisce about a, bat mitzvah parsha. So I imagine that it brings back, and again, that's also part of it, right? What is the context in which in our own lives that we are encountering these pieces, right? That yes, historical context matters, but so does the function, right? As one of my colleagues and friends, Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belser, once said to me, I don't remember the context in which she shared this, but she once said that it's as important to understand, and also it was either her or I'm remembering another colleague, Dr. Darla Shum, who's also a really brilliant theologian, not Jewish herself, but very interested in disability theology. One of them said to me at some point, I cannot remember which one said it, but I want to say it in the name of the one who taught me, that religious texts in their context and in their practice that is an important understanding as much as the historical context. And that's why I want to invite us to hold all of that together, because these texts have so many different layers of meaning.
Thank you. I'm being encouraged to share my question. So
yes, please.
While I ask, please join me in asking questions. So in this in this 20 or so versions of text, I see clouds in different capacity mentioned 3 times, and that feels like a really interesting visualization to bring up again. And so I'm curious, I'll even find them in verse 2, and thick clouds, the peoples. In verse 6, dust clouds of camels shall cover you. Maybe that is just an interesting translation, and that what's a dust cloud of camels? And in verse 8, who are these that float like a cloud? And so I was just wondering if you could talk through the visualization of a cloud and how these verses may or may not talk to each other.
Yeah, so if we look at the second verse, I think that's a really interesting question about the role that imagery of clouds plays here. And my understanding of it, I really want to keep thinking about that. My understanding of it is it's a way of getting across this point of like, we are going to be, trying to think of the right word here. We are going to prevail. We are going to return to this former glory that we had. We're going, like, all these other peoples are going to have this other experience. I'm thinking about, like, if we look at verse 6, like this dust cloud of camels, right? Like, what does that mean? And I am feeling like, again, there's like this overarching, and I want to keep thinking on this because I feel like this is not the most satisfactory answer that I'm giving, but what are the ways in which this powerful imagery and these powerful ideas are being used to make a point of like how, honestly, how diminished other nations are going to be by these, and how strong we are going to be in contrast to them. And I think it's an important thing to, to think about, because if you've been downtrodden, which the people have been for a long time, you're going to really want the kind of comfort and this notion of like, it's not going to last forever. Things will change. And when they do, you will find that your status has been um, maybe we could say restored, given to you, something of that nature. And that clouds like play this role of like dampening other people's place in a different way, which is like, I want to name, I think it's really important to actually confront this because it can feel hard. But I think if we actually also bring it to kind of take it away from the macro, which Isaiah is presenting us, and how many times in our own personal lives, which gets us right back to Elul, how many times in our own personal lives do we kind of want that, right? How many of us have had the thought of like, I'm feeling really downtrodden. Things have been real bad for me. I've been feeling a sense of deep exile from myself, from others, deep senses of disconnection. And I want to bring that back. And I want, and it will change. And one day I will have this new place given to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a few messages. Some are public and some are direct to me.
Right?
Go into this sort of question about return and sort of the theological implications of that.
Mhm.
Gail says, I can imagine a group that experienced or heard from their elders about their ousting from Zion being wary about return. Like,
Mm,
could what happened to them happen to us? And I find that to be a pretty interesting question in terms of we think about the deep happiness that would go with returning, but also what anxieties come with that. And Sylvia is giving a verse. Apologies. Sorry, people are sharing some verses that they find interesting.
mm,
Um, okay, for anger, I struck you down, but Sarah asks, for in anger, I struck you down, but in favor, I take you back. Can we trust that? I think
mm,
a similar question, but really, really interesting theologically. And Mark says that, you mentioned that context is really important, and how do we think about applying our texts to our situation today, and how what does it look like to do both? He says, I'm sure folks in the pews this Shabbat hopefully will make the connections because that is how they look at things. So can you talk through
totally.
your thoughts on when and how to contextualize and when to bring it home?
Absolutely. So those are great. I feel like we have three different questions, and maybe that's kind of how we'll move us to a close today with like kind of weaving all of that together. We'll see at the end if there's a little more time. But I want to start with the first question about, thinking about the people hearing from their elders about their ousting from Zion and the notion of like return and being really wary of that. Could the same thing happen I think that that's based on my own limited human experience. I think that is a very skillful response in the sense of like that's a very natural thing to be like, if that could happen here, could that happen to us? Like it's happened once. And it's so interesting also because I think that we humans also can engage in sort of the thinking of like, that happened then, but it won't happen to us, obviously, right? So I think we can sort of sit with both of those. And understanding the wariness, I think, could also play into understanding why it is that Isaiah is talking so rapturously, right? If we're looking at this text, just so rapturously about what's going to happen when the return happens and how amazing it's going to be. I could imagine, again, using our, best imaginations, like maybe that's a way of kind of convincing folks, like, oh, this could be really, this could go in all kinds of different directions that I wasn't thinking it could go. So I think that there's something there for sure. Um, I think also in terms of can we trust the notion of an anger I struck you down in favor I take you back, right? I believe that Rabbi Shai held, I have to find exactly where this is, so don't quote me because I'm thinking of this off the top of my head. It might be in the Heart of Torah. I don't recall if it's either in the Heart of Torah or if it's in Judaism is about love. But in one of those books, Rav Shai talks about how sometimes and again, we have to be super careful about this because Rav Held also talks about the ways in which this idea becomes very anti-Jewish very quickly. So I'm going to be very careful in how I articulate it. The idea of sometimes there is an idea that God is expressed metaphorically as behaving in ways that are really problematic, and that we would not want people to behave in those ways in human relationships. I think he might even talk about the ways in which this kind of reflects an abusive situation. And and there's also the idea, right, that often gets trotted out by people who have more of a disfavorable, I'll put that really mildly, relationship to Judaism, where they assume that our God is this God of wrath and the God of the Christian scripture is a God of love. And that is just not the case, right? Actually, what the truth is that ours is a tradition of deep love. This Haftarah shows that. And there are ways in which God acts very angrily and displays a lot of emotions that are really complicated and that we have to sit with. And that it's very interesting that God has this emotional complexity and emotional life, but we have to be really aware of how we are choosing to relate to that. And so, in terms of this verse in particular, I think that we have to be really mindful of how we understand our relationship to the divine. If we understand that God is angry and we're sinning all the time, which I strongly think is not an accurate Jewish understanding, but if we take those metaphors and bring them to their logical conclusion, then yeah, we can't really trust in this idea because everything feels so conditional and fickle. It's like, well, if God's going to behave in this very angry way, and then all of a sudden, great, will be taken back. Well, how do you know that that's not going to change? So I think in those moments, we have to really, to Mark's question, which I'll get to in a second, we then have the opportunity to think about this text in context of everything that has come after, thinking about our Siddur and the beautiful images of God that were given there. Ahava Rabbah, with a great love. I love you. You say that twice a day in two different forms. Thinking about, how to understand. It doesn't solve the theological question. I do not have a neat theology. I have a very complicated theology, and I have a theology that is shifting over time, that really seeks not to turn away from what is in the text and doesn't often seek to apologize for it. When I say apologize, I mean that in the academic term of trying to make everything neat or everything have an easy explanation. I think we have to grapple with the different ways in which our ancestors who brought these texts down to us, particularly the prophet Isaiah, thought about God and used the different metaphors that they had available to them. And we can ask ourselves, does that work? And so sometimes I think we have to be, and again, this is my own perspective on it. You may totally disagree with me. We have to then use our seichel. We have to use our wise heart, our wise mind to ask, is this metaphor of a God acting angrily, is this serving or is this actually harming? Right? And if so, what are the metaphors of a loving God, of a trusting God, of a foundational God that we can actually really find more in? So that's something that I would encourage us to do. And there's a really beautiful book by Rabbi Tova Spitzer called God is Here, which if you haven't read, I recommend profoundly. It's this beautiful exploration of different divine metaphors, especially this time of year when we're about to move into the Machzor with a very monarchical understanding of God as king, especially on Rosh Hashanah. I think it's a really wise book to go back through. So it's called God is Here by Tova Spitzer. I am planning to reread it myself. And then the final question about, people in the pews this weekend, this Shabbos, how are they thinking about this? I think that there's a lot of power that rabbis and other spiritual leaders, rabbis, cantors, other spiritual leaders have in bringing these ancient texts alive for a contemporary audience. And I think that there's incredible power and potential in, particularly with this Haftarah, of bringing these different psukim into conversation with what we're actually facing right now, right? We don't live in a world that is separate from the actual reality that we're in. We're in this reality. We need to meet it, right? We need to be honest with it and grapple with it. What we also must do, I believe, when we're in that place, is to get clear with ourselves. And I say this to everybody, whether you are, leading a service or sitting in the congregation, to get really clear with ourselves about what's coming up for us that's influencing our interpretation. Because ultimately, I firmly believe that every interpretation of a text is not in a vacuum. Every interpretation of a text is rooted in the interpreter's own biases, even when they do not recognize them, even when we do not recognize them. So that's when interpretations of the Tanakh can get very dangerous, because anybody out there can take anything they want and apply it anywhere they want and go any direction they want to go. That's why it's so important to know context and to look at things within their context. So I want to encourage us to be aware of where our interpretations are coming from and what are they being influenced by. And at the same time, how can we take these texts and bring them out to teach really important and often really hard lessons about where we actually are? That's really important. And to be able to bring moral lessons, to invite us into hard investigations of our own neshamot, our own souls, our own communities, like all of that is really important. And I think that these texts give us that opportunity. So I wanna close there. Yeah, I'll pass it back over.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thank you all for joining us on our deep dive into Isaiah. We have 1 week left, and I hope reading the Haftorah energizes you, fills you with some blessings, and makes you excited to hopefully join us tomorrow for Torah study. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.